Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I need to give a quick warning. Story number 2 touches on the subjects of murder, and story number 3 involves mentions of sexual abuse. I'll also include those warnings in the timestamps below, along with the pinned comment. Now, with that out of the way, let's get started. And remember, always stay alert, stay hungry. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, my grandfather worked as a police officer in a small town. It was a quiet place, not much happening beyond the occasional drug bust, but nothing too crazy until one night. My grandfather was on patrol when he noticed a van swerving and driving recklessly. He turned on his lights, pulling the vehicle over. As he approached, he introduced himself and explained why he stopped them. The driver and his passenger, two Hispanic men, looked uneasy. My grandfather mentioned that they were driving erratically and that one of their brake lights was out. The passenger asked if he could open the rear hatch and see if he could fix it. Being a mechanic, my grandfather agreed, but he first needed to run the driver's license and insurance. As he called in the driver's information, the dispatcher's voice grew frantic. She told him to stay in his vehicle and wait for backup. Minutes later, backup arrived. The officers searched the van, and when the two men were pulled from the back, they were both armed with shotguns. My grandfather hadn't seen the weapons because the van's windows were blocked. It turned out these men were transporting drugs from Mexico into the US. That night, what seemed like a routine traffic stop turned into something far more dangerous. Now, let me take a moment to explain how I know this story. It's not mine, but my father's. He was a cop back in those days, and he doesn't often talk about his experiences. He shared this one with me almost a decade ago after I returned from my first appointment. He's since kept quiet about it, but I know he wouldn't mind me sharing the story as long as I kept some personal details private. Many of the events and circumstances were pieced together from what I remember, some local newspaper articles, and even old cassette tapes of radio transmissions from that night. Just a bit of background. My dad served as a police officer for nearly 30 years. He worked everything from regular patrol to SWAT, sniper, undercover drug task forces, and more. He was an experienced officer, and this story takes place in the early 90s, in the heart of the rural Midwest. This was a town with only a few thousand people, surrounded by farmland and notorious for its meth trade. It was the perfect environment for drugs, given its isolation and access to chemicals. Two brothers, John and Mike Smith, were heavily involved in this local drug scene. John, in particular, had a reputation for violence and erratic behavior. Besides dealing meth, he'd been known to abuse his girlfriend and even hold family members at gunpoint. Both brothers were often in trouble with the law, but at the time of this story, they were both on probation and forbidden from associating with one another. But that night, they were together, and when my dad spotted them, he called it in and tried to pull them over. As soon as he lit them up, they bolted. The chase was intense. My dad stayed calm over the radio as he relayed the situation. He chased them all the way to Mike's house, where the brothers tried to make a run for it. John made it to the porch and inside, but Mike wasn't as fast. My dad grabbed him just as he reached the front door. They struggled on the porch, and that's when John reappeared with a Tech-9, pointing it directly at my dad's head. It happened fast. My dad, seeing the gun, instinctively shoved Mike in front of him, ducking behind him for cover. He pulled out his own pistol and fired a single shot over Mike's shoulder. John collapsed, and my dad quickly subdued Mike, cuffing him. He called in the shots fired, reporting that one suspect was down. His voice was calm, but you could hear the stress in his words. Backup arrived, and as expected in a small town, word spread quickly. John's family tried to claim my dad murdered him. An investigation followed, and one of John's friends even claimed to have seen my dad drunk at a bar. bragging about the shooting. But everyone who knew my dad knew he didn't drink not once in his life. The story fell apart. Eventually, the investigation cleared my dad of any wrongdoing. The shooting was deemed justified, but John's family couldn't accept it. They printed bumper stickers, "Remember John Smith," and the local paper covered the story. They used a photo of my dad in uniform 6'4", muscular, with a serious expression, while John's picture was an old high school photo, showing him smiling despite his troubled life. Years later, Mike went to prison, and after his release, he vowed to kill my dad before taking his own life. But Mike never made good on that threat. He died of a heart attack before he could act. My dad retired after almost 30 years on the force. For a while, he seemed a bit down. He didn't enjoy the internal politics of police work, but he loved the job itself. He later moved to a new city and began working at a halfway house, counseling veterans with PTSD. That's where he found a new sense of purpose. Many of his former residents still visit him, thanking him for seeing potential in them when no one else did. He often tells me that if it weren't for his time as a cop, he wouldn't have been able to relate to the people he now helps. He remembers something his field training officer once told him: "Most of the so-called bad people you deal with are actually good people who just made really bad decisions. The truly evil ones are the exception, not the rule." That lesson has stuck with him ever since. Stay safe out there, everyone. And before we move on to the next story, let me tell you about something that happened when I was in high school. I discovered a stolen car, and what could have been a small incident almost turned into something much darker. Every day after school, I'd head upstairs to the bathroom. It was a simple routine. I'd do my business, glance out the window, and go about my day. I never thought much about it, but one day, something made me stop. What I saw through that window changed everything. The stolen car. It was a normal winter morning. I was at home, sitting by the window, when I noticed something out of place in the parking lot across the street. It had snowed heavily the night before, leaving the ground blanketed in a thick layer of white. The world outside looked peaceful, serene even, but as I gazed out into the frosty landscape, my attention was drawn to a car parked at the far end of the lot. It was an older sedan, but what struck me immediately was that the driver's side window was wide open. In the middle of winter, after a heavy snowstorm, that was odd. The snow had settled on the rest of the car, covering it entirely except for the open window. The sight immediately sparked my curiosity. My first thought was that it must be an older car, one with a broken window that didn't roll up anymore. Maybe someone had left it there and forgotten to close it. Possibly someone who had been out drinking. There were a lot of possibilities that went through my head as I tried to make sense of the situation. For a few days, the car sat there, the window still open, and the vehicle unmoved. I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. Something just didn't feel right about it. It wasn't just the fact that the window was open, it was the way it had been sitting there abandoned. After a while, I started to think that maybe the car had been stolen and dumped there, left to rot, with no one caring about its fate. I knew I had to do something about it. I decided to be a good Samaritan. I took down the make, model, and license plate number of the car and decided to report it. I went to my school's police liaison officer's office, which, to be honest, didn't seem like much more than a custodian's closet with a window door. The window was covered with black construction paper, a bizarre choice considering the purpose of the office. It was meant to offer privacy to students who needed to speak to the officer, but to me, it always seemed a bit odd, a little shady even. When I arrived at the office, I found the officer in a meeting with another student. I knocked on the door several times, but there was no response. I had to leave to go back to class, so I handed the information to a friend and asked them to give it to the officer later. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I would soon learn that something was very wrong with the situation. Later that day, I was called down to the school foyer. There, I was met by the police liaison officer and a uniformed police officer. It turned out the car had been reported stolen, and the officer needed me to show him where it was. I was excused from school for a bit, and the uniformed officer and I drove to my neighborhood, where I pointed out the car. I showed him exactly where it was parked, and after filling out some paperwork with the officer, I was driven back to school by the liaison officer. But this is where things took a darker turn. I'd always had an uneasy feeling about the school's liaison officer. It wasn't just the strange office with the covered window that made me suspicious. I had witnessed his behavior towards students in the past, and it was more than a little unsettling. He was overly friendly with many of the students, which on the surface seemed harmless enough, but the things he would say made me uncomfortable. I remember him joking with students in ways that crossed the line. There was one particular remark that stuck with me. If you went camping and woke up with your butt hurting, would you tell anyone? At first, the students would laugh it off, as though he was just being one of the guys joking around, but something about it felt off. His jokes made me feel uneasy, and I wasn't the only one who noticed it. I'd seen other students react similarly. Not sure how to respond, but brushing it off because of the officer's position. On the drive back to school that day, after helping the police with the stolen car case, the liaison officer asked me what my plans for the weekend were. I'm a shy person, so I stumbled over my words. I didn't have anything planned, really, but I said I had to get an oil change on my car. He laughed, saying I must have something more fun planned than that. But I didn't have anything else to offer. Then, out of nowhere, he offered to buy me lunch at a fast food place a block away from school. At the time, I thought it was a kind gesture, a reward for my help in reporting the stolen car. But looking back now, I wonder if it was something more sinister. Maybe it was an attempt to groom me, to lure me into a false sense of security. He had always been too friendly, too familiar, and the way he offered to buy me lunch felt off. It seemed like a reward, but now I can't help but feel it was something darker. It was a clear attempt to make me feel indebted, to make me trust him. Several months later, everything I had suspected about the liaison officer came to light. The news broke that he had been arrested for sexually abusing several male students at the school. The abuse had been going on for a while, and the officer had even paid the students to engage in sexual acts. The authorities discovered VHS tapes of the encounters, and when his brother found one of them, he immediately turned the officer in. It was chilling to learn that my instincts had been right all along. He had been using his position to manipulate and hurt vulnerable students. The officer was convicted of several counts of sexual abuse and sentenced to prison. But by then, I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened to me. What if he had tried something with me that day when we were alone in the car? I couldn't help but imagine how the situation could have turned dangerous. What if I had refused his offer for lunch or said something that triggered him? What if he had threatened me, or worse, used his position to coerce me into doing something I didn't want to? Looking back, I wonder if the black construction paper on his office window was there to hide something much darker than just private conversations. Maybe it was to cover up the illegal activities happening behind those closed doors. I'll never know for sure, but I'm just grateful nothing happened to me. It's heartbreaking to think about the students who were abused by this man. I hope they're doing okay now, but I know that their trauma is something that will stay with them forever. The whole experience serves as a stark reminder that sometimes people who are supposed to protect you aren't always who they appear to be. Trusting the wrong person, especially someone in a position of authority, can lead to devastating consequences. The white van incident a few months after the events at my school. I had moved to France for work, fresh out of college and eager to begin a new chapter of my life. I had a night shift job at an international hotel in one of the safest areas of the city. I didn't know much French, but I was managing. trying to get by with basic phrases and gestures. One night, I had to borrow a car while mine was being repaired. The only available car was a white van, like the kind delivery drivers or moving companies use. It wasn't ideal, but it got the job done. I made my way to work without incident, and everything seemed fine. It was on the way back home when things took a turn. I was driving through a quiet residential area, the streets lit by dim street lamps far off in the distance, when I noticed flashing blue lights in my rearview mirror. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just some minor issue with the van. Maybe a light was out or something. I pulled over, as you're supposed to, and rolled down my window. I was a new driver, eager to comply with the law. I prepared to show the officer my driver's license when the man approached my window. However, this was no ordinary officer. He was wearing civilian clothes, which struck me as odd. He asked something in French, but I couldn't understand him. I asked if he spoke English, and he repeated himself. His tone was a little strange, but I still thought nothing of it at the time. He asked where I was headed, and I answered, thinking it was just a routine question. Then, he asked where I lived and seemed surprised when I told him I lived far from my workplace. He asked where I worked as well, his nervousness becoming more apparent. I answered politely, not thinking anything was out of the ordinary. What should have been a quick interaction suddenly grew uncomfortable when he peered into the van. There was nothing inside, no deliveries, no mattresses, nothing to suggest I was up to something illicit. He looked back at me, seemingly disappointed, and simply told me to go home. For a while, I brushed the encounter off, thinking it was just an undercover officer doing his job. But one day, while talking to my coworkers about the experience, they stared at me, dead serious, and told me that white vans were often used by prostitutes. Apparently, it was common for such vans to be used as makeshift spaces where services were offered. My coworkers warned me that the man who stopped me might not have been a cop at all. He could have been someone pretending to be a cop, looking for a vulnerable woman to take advantage of. If that wasn't eerie enough, a week later, I learned that a girl from a nearby neighborhood had been kidnapped by a man in a white van, similar to the one I'd borrowed. This sent chills down my spine. What if I had been the target? What if I had fallen into his trap?